So the Mark V II Star, for a start, of course, it was done as a new version of the Mark V Star. It was the same length. And we ought to talk about length a little bit, because with the demise of the Germans, with their sudden retreat and their demise in November 1918, you can't see the need for these wider tanks. And I think they were all built like this because we imagined that the war would go on into 1919. Everyone was thinking like that. And we imagined that the Germans would build wider trenches in defense of the homeland as much as anything else. So we needed wider or longer tanks to get over them. And this is the Mark V II Star. It's about 23, 24 feet long. And you'll see it's fitted with the wider 26.5-inch tracks. For some reason, they decided to reduce the weight on these tanks by increasing the width of the track from 20.5 inches to 26.5. And it means that each tank has an overlapped area of track sticking out round the side. The drawback was that every time it went over any sort of rough ground, this part tended to weaken. It wasn't really the best idea to put wider tracks on and just expect the tank to stand on them, because so much of the weight was taken by the end of the track itself. But that's how they did it. And it was a feature of most of these later pattern tanks. So what they've done basically is built a Mark V with about 6 feet of extra armour or so on in the centre of the tank. The only difference is in the Mark V II Star, they've altered the layout of the front part so that it's more balanced. It's a better design altogether, and therefore more easy to steer than the old Mark V Star, which used to lumber about rather badly. They've also moved the commander's separate cupola from the back to the front, so it comes up behind the driver's cab. They've also fitted the Ricardo 225 horsepower engine, much more powerful than the old 105 that the ordinary Mark V had in it, and also moved the engine further back to alter the point of balance, really, which is what they were after. Now, what they decided to do, they had, and I'll come to this a bit more with the Mark VIII later on, but they had their doubts in Britain about not the ability of America to produce the Mark VIII, but whether enough of them will get across the Atlantic, or the bits of them, to warrant building them in this country and in France. So they built the Mark V II Star as an insurance against that. It was here, it was nearly as powerful, and it had the length to deal with the problems they foresaw. And that's why this tank was considered as an alternative to the Mark VIII in the last months of the war, and why it would have been involved, if it had been, in Plan 1919. That's what makes it so different. This particular tank is a female. You can tell that by the way the sponsons are arranged. And it stayed for years, as did most of the Mark V II Stars. They were actually issued to the experimental bridging establishment at Christchurch. And they were used with jibs fitted to the front with different kinds of hoists on them. This one had a hydraulic jib with a Janny pump at the back, and it was designed to carry and lay bridges and destroy pillboxes with a demolition charge, and also to trail mine rollers in front of it. So it was really a universal Royal Engineer tank, a forerunner, if you like, of the Avery of World War II. But there's a long gap between them, so there's no actual influence of the two. And it would be used to do, in Fuller's words, the initial breakthrough of the front when the other tanks were sweeping around the back, the faster tanks. And that was really the whole idea behind these large, heavy tanks. So now we've come across to look at the Mark VIII. And the Mark VIII is the tank as far as Plan 1919 is concerned. But it all came at a bad time. The armistice intervened. They had originally ordered 655 for the British, and they only built about 24 of them. And out of those 24, only 6 or 7 were used in army service. So it really was the end of the Mark VIII. But this was the tank that was going to lead the way in the main frontal assaults in Plan 1919. Now, we know it as the Mark VIII. It was also known as the International or the Anglo-American tank because it involved British and American designers. It was a bit of a step away from what we'd done up until now. The sponson behind me was actually designed by Herbert Alden, who was a major in the United States Army. He was working with John Rackham, who was doing the basic vehicle design. So the two of them together really designed this tank. And it was only produced as a male. You only see this version with the 6-pounder sponson. And the reason is that on top, and the superstructure on top were the machine guns, and it really did the job of both male and female in that sense. Now, what they were going to do originally was order 1,500 of these tanks, and they were to be built by armour and bits and pieces sent over from Britain, and by mechanical parts, including the engine, which was a 300 horsepower Liberty V12 that was going to be shipped across from the United States. And the two would come together at a place called Neuvy-Palus in France, which is now a village. In those days it was just open country, where the French were going to build a factory for the new tanks to be produced so that all the Allies could have them. Britain, America and France. The French actually dropped out quite early on, then changed their minds and decided they'd like some tanks anyway. But the tank itself is quite impressive. It's powered by this V12 engine. Now, the 600-odd tanks ordered in Britain, and in fact they were ordered in Scotland. It was North British Loco and Beardmores who were going to build them. And those tanks had a Ricardo V12 in, because we thought that even if in America they managed to produce a tank version of the V12 Liberty aircraft engine, we thought that U-boats would see them off as they came across the Atlantic and that we'd never have enough of them. So we decided to produce our own engine, which is also why we produced the Mark V two-star as an alternative to this if the Mark VIII wasn't ready in time. But the real key was this massive number that were being produced at the factory in France, if they'd ever got round to it. It's quite an interesting tank in many respects. Although the track is 26.5 inches wide, you'll see they've widened the frames so that they come out to the very edge of the track. This did away with the problem of the track breaking by going over bumps. And they've fitted a dimple into the middle of the track to make it much stronger anyway, so that the whole thing lasted longer. Now that meant that because the track frames were wider, the hull had to be narrower. They wanted the tank to fit the British Railway loading gauge, which was very restrictive because it dated back to 1825. But they did it by doing away with the internal frames that hold the tank together. And they took away those internal frames, increased the floor space. That and the fact that the engine had been moved to the back and put in a separate compartment meant that the crew could move around more readily in the fighting area at the front, which was more sensible. You'll see the driver's cab at the front there. The driver sat above and in the middle and had a jolly good view ahead of him. He also found the tank easy to drive. It only had 2-speed epicyclics, and they acted as gear change and as steering mechanism. Most people thought that a 4-speed epicyclic would work better, but the Americans thought a 2-speed would do, and they appear to have been right. The tank did work perfectly well with a 2-speed epicyclic. The commander and the machine gunners then arranged themselves in that top part so that they could see out on the battlefield and machine gun anyone they didn't like who happened to be wandering about. But they only normally carried 2 machine gunners, so the guys had to hop about a bit to be in the right place at the right time, to fire the machine gun in the right direction. That was one other feature of the tank, which is a little bit odd, but then it saved people tripping over one another. The commander has a raised lookout on top of the vehicle. That raised lookout is designed to be retractable so that if the tank goes on a railway wagon, it won't clear the loading gauge with that thing, so that is lowered a little bit to fit over the roof of the tank when it's not needed by the commander, when it's going by rail, that is. So that's really the Mark VIII. It's about 34 feet long. It's a little bit longer than the others, and therefore quite an excellent tank for dealing with wide trenches, which is what it was designed to do. It also brings in just quickly the Mark VII, which was another tank built in Scotland, a tank with a hydraulic transmission. They ordered 70 of those, but they only produced 2 by the time the armistice came about. So the whole lot were cancelled, and those 2 were given to various museums. One of them came down here to Bovington, the other went to the Imperial War Museum, when they used to have a museum in Crystal Palace, I think. And that's the only real occasion the Mark VII even comes into it. No Mark VII has survived, so we can't see one, but it really looked like a Mark V. Slightly longer at the back and well covered in cooling venters because it needed more air getting into it because it was hydraulic, and the hydraulic tanks tended to build up a lot more heat inside them. So now we'll move on and look at the Mark IX. Now the Mark IX, it's very difficult to lump it in with the other 1919 tanks. It's never actually mentioned as part of Plan 1919, but it must have been intended because there was no other use for it at all. Now they ordered something like 200 of them from Marshals of Gainsborough, but they only seem to have completed about 35 after the armistice put a paid to the whole idea of running tanks a year later. But it's an interesting vehicle anyway. It wasn't a fighting tank, which is why it doesn't have sponsons on the side like any other fighting tank does. It was designed as a troop carrier, or what we call today an armoured personnel carrier. It could take 30 men inside. Now the only difficulty was these 30 men had to stand up. There was nowhere to sit, nowhere comfortable anyway. And right down the middle of the tank was the drive shaft, which was spinning round. So you didn't want to catch your leg on that. And you've got to imagine 30 men swaying uncomfortably in this tank, standing up, because only a few could reach a handhold and steady themselves. Everybody else had to hold on for the best. They never actually did this, so we don't know, but 30 men in there does seem an awful problem. Why they didn't put seats over things like the drive shaft so that some of the men could sit down, heaven knows that they didn't. The tank's quite interesting inside anyway, because they're trying to make as much room as possible within the tank. It was designed to carry 30 men or up to 10 tons of stores inside, which is why it has those 2 huge doors each side that you can load it through, plus more in a roof rack on top and even more on sledges towed behind the tank. But the controls inside are really unusual. The gear change is a lever above the driver's head, and it activates a series of rods that run back to the gearbox at the back. So the engine and all the mechanical parts are as far as possible forward, and the gearbox and transmission as far as possible backwards to make as much room inside as you can do. And that's why they did it. And the other controls, the brake levers, were actually run through the floor. Now the other thing they did to make as much room as possible inside the tank, they cut away most of the interior frames. Normally with a tank you have track frames on the inside here as well as on the outside. And the idea of the other tanks was to have as much frame as possible inside to stiffen them up, to make them stronger. The Mark IX didn't have that. It has most of the frame cut away. They were all designed by a chap called John Rackham, who was a young officer who was in charge of tank design at that time. And this tank is purely his work, they say. One thing you will find if you do get inside, and you can do that if you visit the museum, is across the floor are some huge girders. They're there to stiffen the tank, to keep it reasonably strong while the troops are in there. And the idea was to carry 30 men into action, so that the idea, the theory at least, was that the infantry would arrive at the scene of battle less tired than if they walked. So they climbed out and stood around or went into action straight away. That was the idea, but of course they'd been inside a tank, and a tank is a naturally unpleasant place for anyone to travel in who isn't used to it. It's full of fumes. The tank was well ventilated as tanks go, but you'd still get some fumes coming up, and that would all make it unpleasant, and the motion itself is unpleasant. Plus the men are in the dark, they don't know where they're going, except that it's to be shot at, so they know that when they get out they're in action straight away, and that's why the tank was designed as it is. Quite unusual at the front, the driver sits extremely hard over to the left, as you can see, and therefore it's almost a left-hand drive tank, and that does seem odd for a British tank. Directly behind it is a lookout that was put up there for the commander so that he could view the battlefield from inside in relative safety, and to the other side was a Hotchkiss machine gun position. Now that raises another interesting point. There's a machine gun position at the front and another one at the back designed for the tank crew to use, and the Hotchkiss, the air-cooled Hotchkiss, was the standard tank corps machine gun. But there are a number of loopholes down each side of the tank. They're there for putting rifles through. I think 5 of them each side are capable of taking a machine gun, but they're fitted inside with a mounting that looks as if it's meant to take the Hotchkiss, which would be unusual because the British infantry didn't carry the Hotchkiss machine gun. It wasn't used by them. Instead, they used the Lewis gun, which has a much larger jacket. And we think, possibly, you could get the Lewis gun through the holes in the side of the tank, and it would give the tank a fair amount of anti-infantry firepower. But as I say, they were never used. It never actually came to that. The tank itself was lethargically slow. It would do 4 miles an hour on a good day, and that's not very much. Really, it's probably due to the amount of track in contact with the ground. It makes these tanks difficult to steer and very sluggish. The idea is to have as few feet as possible of track actually touching the ground at any one time, and that seems to have been the main fault with the Mark IX. A few of them were intended to be hospital tanks. They were going to carry stretchers, but I still don't understand why they needed a tank carrying 10 tons of stores. The ordinary supply tanks, which they'd used up until then, carried enough supplies for 5 battle tanks. That's in the way of fuel, water, extra ammunition, and that sort of thing. And that was enough. And I think 5 battle tanks on the battlefield is as much as you want to see in a day if you're going around loading them up. But 10 tons of stores seems amazing to me, unless it was for the infantry, in which case they probably used it. But a lot of their stuff is rather bulky, rather difficult to get in and out those doors. It's all got to be unloaded and carried to the place of action at the time anyway, so it's quite hard work. Still, it makes an interesting vehicle. The idea that a troop carrier could be used on the battlefield as early as 1918, 1919, quite remarkable. But none of this came to pass. The whole tank story, as far as the Mark IX is concerned, more or less ends with the armistice. There are just a few that were kept for a while and then disposed of. And this is now the only survivor. Right, I thought I'd start off. I'm just going to talk about the medium tanks now. We don't have a medium B or a medium C, so I'm going to just talk about them quickly. Now, the B was designed by Walter Wilson. He tried to make it as short as possible by putting the 4-cylinder Ricardo engine in. In fact, he probably made it too short. They say the tank was very cramped and uncomfortable. They were only used for training and weren't produced in large numbers. Now, the medium C was designed by Sir William Tritton of Foster's, and it is always reckoned to be the best tank of the whole First World War, better than anything we've produced up until then. It's a fat lot of good because it didn't appear until after the armistice. Now, the medium C was bigger than the medium B. It was powered by a 6-cylinder Ricardo engine, the same as you'd find in a Mark V or a later tank. So it's quite a good and powerful machine. But the tank has gone. They saved one up until the time of the war and then scrapped it. And that was the last medium C that we had a chance to get, and it's gone now. But the tank that followed it is the tank that really matters. The medium D was the tank that General Fuller decided was going to be the, if you like, the main strength of his Plan 1919. Now again, we haven't got, no medium D has survived. And the real secret of the medium D was the suspension. Up until this time, no British tank had any suspension at all. But Johnson, bearing in mind the weight that suspension could add to a tank, designed a complex system which had springs at each end and then had wire rope. And the wire rope ran under each one of these pulleys here and over a similar pulley in the frame of the tank. So that in a way it acted as a suspension. As this wheel was displaced by a bump in the ground, it pulled on the wire and pulled the spring. The track's what they called snake track. It was only ever produced for the light infantry tank, and really, although it follows the principle of the medium D in that it's flexible both laterally and individually, each shoe will go its own way over rough ground, it's a bit different from the one that was used. The one that was used on the medium D had a central core of flexible steel wire rope, the same system as they used for the suspension of the track. The tank itself was, the light infantry tank that is, was taken into the tank museum but scrapped. And the only thing they've salved from it is one section here with 2 bogies in it and the piece of track. That's all we've got left of this tank. But it does do to illustrate how the suspension worked on the medium D, and it was really quite unique. Okay, now if you enjoyed that bit of film, or any of the bits of film we've made, if you'd subscribe to YouTube, that helps us a great deal, and more so if you'll support Patreon, because that's something that we really can do with. Thanks very much.